When I'm painting skin textures, one of my favorite tools is an incredibly simple one, and it costs nothing to make. Almost every wrinkle that you see on this painting, which I'm currently working on, was painted in using a simple piece of ripped copy paper. And the great thing about this technique is that it's easy to use and free to make using stuff that you already have at home. At this point in the portrait, I only have the face and hand painted in, but all of this was done using that one color that we mixed in last week's video, a bit of sepia for the shadows, a few airbrush shields, and of course, some copy paper. So we're going to pick this one up right from where we left off in last week's video. So grab yourself a few sheets of paper that you might have lying around, and all you need to do is rip out a few different shapes from it. I generally like to rip out smaller pieces because for me, they're just easier to handle and move around the painting. What you get here is an edge that has a subtle texture to it, and when you spray a small amount of paint over this edge, that texture transfers to the surface that you're painting on. I ripped out a slight curve in this piece of paper, and what I'm doing here is lining it up with this crease. And as I spray over it, I'll kind of move it around to fit my initial line drawing underneath. And once it's removed, you can see that we get a very thin line here, but that line has some texture to it. It's not perfectly straight. It's important to point out here that this is not some magic tool where you could just lay this on and spray over it and then you get all the wrinkles you want. What we're doing here is actually just adding in the shadows of the wrinkles. Every wrinkle on the skin, no matter how large or how small, is in 3 dimensions. And just like anything else in a 3-dimensional space, light is going to reflect and play off each one of these wrinkles. As I talked about in last week's video, we know that the light source for this portrait is above the subject and over to the left. And how do we know this? It's very easy. All you need to do is look at the eye. You could see that the specular highlight is above and to the left of the pupil. So that's where the light source is coming from. And just like how the light is reflecting off the eye, it's also going to reflect off each one of these wrinkles in that same direction. But of course, the highlights on the skin are not going to be as bright because the skin and the eye are 2 very different textures. The eye is very smooth, and obviously it has tears in it, which is basically a thin layer of mucus covering it. And that surface is going to be much more reflective than the graininess that we have on skin. So on these wrinkles and skin texture, the light is still going to be coming from that same direction, but the reflection itself is going to be much more diffused. It's going to be softer and a bit more subtle than what you get in the eye. So what I did here using that ripped piece of paper was just add in a bunch of shadows first. And the next thing we're going to need to do is add in the highlights. But before we get to that, I want to use my skin texture template that we made in last week's video. And I'm just going to lightly, randomly spray this around the area I just painted in. The goal of this is to break up that soft airbrush look just by adding in some random texture. Then I can go back to my airbrush freehand and start laying in some paint right over the top of this. I'm going to spray a bit more paint toward the bottom where the shadow is darker. And then I just want to glaze a thin layer of paint over this whole area so I have something to erase into. Now that we have the paint in, we could switch over to the eraser and start pulling out these highlights to the left of each one of these shadows. At this point, the wrinkles that we painted in with the ripped piece of paper don't really give off that 3D effect. They're just basically rough, thin lines. But as I start to add in these highlights to the left, these dark lines now start to look like shadows. And then when we look at this as a painting, we see this as a wrinkle, so the illusion starts to come together. And all I'm going to do is work my way around each one of these wrinkles, pulling out that highlight to the left side. This way you have a highlight, then kind of a mid-tone where the light is kind of falling away, and then it goes into that deep shadow that we painted in using the ripped piece of paper. And at this point where I have a fair amount of these highlights pulled out, we can see how this illusion starts to work. These brighter areas just look like they're kind of protruding from the surface of the skin. They're like sticking out a little bit farther. And then those deeper dark shadows underneath look like they're rounding away, moving away from us. And it's important to remember that painting in this style is about creating a bunch of illusions that come together to form a final painting, in this case, a portrait. And the illusion that we're creating here is taking something from a 3D space, from life, a person, this woman, and we're translating the way that light reflects and plays off of her in real life onto a flat surface, onto a 2-dimensional surface, which is our canvas. So that ripped piece of paper works very well for one part of this portrait, which are those skin wrinkles. You use that to paint in the shadows, glaze some paint over the top, and then switch over to the eraser to erase out the corresponding highlights. And when I'm painting, the easiest way to get to a final painting is to work slowly by building up layer after layer. So that's what you'll see me doing here. I'm just erasing into it, and then if it erases out too much, I'll add another layer of paint and then go back to the eraser and just kind of repeat that cycle over and over until I'm happy with what I see. And while I'm painting these in, try to pay attention to the completed painting, which is on the left side of the screen, so you can see what I'm painting towards, and that way you can see the process of how I build it up to that final work. On the left side of the eye, we have some deeper and some darker wrinkles. So I did the same thing, starting with that ripped piece of paper to spray in the shadows. From here, to get some of these highlights a bit brighter, I'm using an electric eraser along with my stick eraser. An electric eraser is extremely aggressive, so the way I like to use it is kind of sparingly, just not too much. I'll just tap it here in the brightest part of this highlight. And to blend those bright highlights in, I switch back over to my stick eraser and then use different amounts of pressure just to create a gradient from really bright to that mid-tone where it starts shifting over to the shadow. And the way I do this is very simple. I just use less pressure as I get closer to the shadow. And this is the main reason that I love using a stick eraser on a gessoed surface, like in this case, which is a gessoed canvas. It basically works just like drawing. And what I like about this is that this style of painting is extremely forgiving because you have two different ways to build up gradients. You could start with the airbrush, add more paint for a darker area, and then spray less as you get to a lighter area. And also, if you have paint down, you could use the eraser in the opposite way by using more pressure to pull out a bright area. And then as you move toward a shadow, you use less pressure, getting a subtle gradient from light to dark. So let's move along to the area above the eye, which is going to be the eyebrow and the brow ridge itself. I'm still using that flesh tone in the airbrush, and the first thing I'm doing here is painting in some softer lines to make it look like there's some hair in the eyebrows. And it's important to me that I keep these lines soft so it looks like some hair in the background. I'm also going to use my skin texture template just to lightly spray over this area, again, just to help break up that airbrush look. I also want to get in a few of those wrinkles just above the eyebrow. So just like before, I'm using that ripped piece of paper, spraying over it, and that's going to give me those shadows for the wrinkles. And this is another good example to demonstrate what I was talking about before. At this point, to me, these don't look anything like wrinkles, right? They just look like some rough lines painted in. And the reason for that is very simple. It's just because the highlights were not added in yet. So later we'll switch over to the eraser, add highlights to the left and slightly above these creases to pull it all together. But before we switch over to the eraser, I want to use this small scratching tool to pull out a few random flyaway hairs within the eyebrow. I talked about this tool in last week's video, and I'm using it here just to flick out a few random lines. Now, these are going to be very bright because it's pulling out all the paint. That's not a problem though. If these are too bright, we can come back to the airbrush later, glaze some paint over it, and then knock down those values. As I'm scratching these in, I'm constantly looking at my reference photo, and that's guiding me. That's telling me where these highlights need to be, where these small flyaway hairs need to be. The next tool that I'm going to use is a brown colored pencil. Now, these are going to look like some hairs in between those soft ones that we painted in before with the airbrush and those really bright highlights that we just pulled out with that scratching tool. And these hairs are going to be very soft and just kind of blend into the skin itself, and that's what I want. I want them subtle and subdued. If I want a few more defined hairs, some sharper details, I'll use a black colored pencil like what I'm using right here. And I'm just sketching a few of those into the darker areas where the shadows are. In my experience, the easiest way to add in a bunch of small hairs is just to go with a colored pencil. It's very easy to move this quickly and get some random hairs and some random lines in. And another great thing about it too is that you can control how dark it is by how much pressure you use. And at this point, this is basically done. I just want to use my airbrush to spray in some of those darker shadows and also use my eraser to erase out a few of the skin textures in between the hairs. As I move along to the right side of the painting, I'm going to work on these wrinkles that are on the bridge of the nose. I'm going to speed through a lot of this because it's that same process over and over of using that ripped piece of paper first, getting in those shadows, spraying that paint over the top, and then erasing the highlights. There's nothing in any way complicated about this, but the most important thing is really focus on what you're looking at. Pay attention to that reference. Try to see the little nuances and just see if you can find things that you didn't notice originally. And this is why slowing down and taking breaks is so important to me when I'm painting. Trying to paint like this quickly or to try to get this done in one sitting, to me, is just completely impossible. It's about working in small intervals, maybe like 20 minutes to a half hour, and then taking a break and coming back. When you do that, you kind of reset your brain and your eyes, and you're going to start to see things that you didn't notice in that first sitting. And this works both ways. I'll see new things in the reference that I'm working from, whether it's from life or from a photograph, like in this example. And then also I'll see things in my painting that I didn't notice originally as I was painting, some mistakes. Maybe some areas are too dark or too light, a bunch of things that I'll need to adjust and fix. The two techniques that are most important to me are always observation and patience. This style of painting is all about paying attention to what you see and then finding any way in your ability and skills to express or translate it to a canvas. And the best way, and probably the only way to improve your observation, is just to keep on painting or drawing. Just remember that there's no real secrets to this, there's no hidden knowledge that you need to learn from, and there's no talent that you need to inherit. It's all about paying attention. And that other skill or technique is just about patience and slowing down. Just like observation, patience in painting builds up with practice. It doesn't matter if you're just starting out or if you've been painting for decades, rushing a painting is a trap that we all fall into. And nowadays with the internet and things like Instagram and YouTube, everything just seems so fast. Fortunately, painting is nothing like that. It's about taking your time and learning to slow down. When you do this, it becomes a lot more enjoyable. Now let's move along to some of these wrinkles that are just above this left eye. If you look at my completed painting, you'll notice that the transition between these wrinkles are very smooth. So instead of using a ripped piece of paper, which is going to give me a rough edge, I'm just going to use an airbrush shield that I made myself. I have these lines marked in from my original drawing that I set up using a grid. And what I'm doing is lining up this shield on each one of these lines and then spraying directly over that transition point. So I get a pretty dark line. With this first line painted in, you can clearly see the difference that this line is a lot smoother and it just doesn't have that texture that you get with a ripped piece of paper. So we're using the same technique here of adding in the shadows first, but the texture is going to be slightly different. And I think this is important in painting, just always kind of adding variety to the textures and just adding some randomness. So I'll speed through this, but all I'm doing here is taking my time, slowly adding in each of these shadows, starting in that area just above the eye, working my way up. When I need to erase out thin highlights like I'm doing here, I like to sharpen my ink erasers in an electric pencil sharpener. And basically you get a very sharp point at the end here, just like you get on a pencil. So you can get in right between these shadows and really pull out the detail that you're looking for. And it works great. The only problem that I have with this is that the eraser tends to dull very quickly when you sharpen it to a point like this. So just understand that you're probably going to go through your eraser a lot quicker if you're sharpening it to a fine point and doing detail work. Because if you sharpen it in the traditional method using a knife or an X-Acto blade, it's going to last longer, but it's just a lot more difficult to control and it's difficult to get in for really thin, bright highlights. One thing that I'm always thinking about while painting is thinking of micro and macro values. These aren't real terms that you'll learn in art school or art history. It's just something that I've always thought about while painting. If you look at these small creases and these small shadows and highlights in these wrinkles, I'd consider that the micro detail. And then this whole area surrounding it, surrounding the eye, where we have different values of light and dark, is what I'd consider to be the macro values. So now that we have the micro details in of those wrinkles, we have to set them in place, set them into this portrait. And if you look at my completed painting on the left, you'll notice that there's a dark shadow on the left side of them where the bridge of the nose is casting it. Then it gets a little bit brighter in the center. And then as it goes up underneath that brow ridge, it gets dark again. Now with using an airbrush, adjusting macro values is the simplest thing. All I need to do is spray more paint in those darker areas and spray less paint in that brighter area. This way, all those micro values and micro details are basically going to stay the same, but we can adjust the macro values surrounding them just by spraying paint over the top, glazing that flesh tone right above them. And I'm not sure if this is helpful for other people, but for me, it's just the way I've always seen it. And it's the approach that I like to take. I'd like to start with those small details first, things like skin textures or wrinkles, get those in place, and then focus on the larger parts of the painting, the macros, to start pulling it together. At this point, I'm going to switch back over to the eraser and start erasing out some textures on this upper eyelid. And you could see here that my eraser is sharpened the traditional or the classic way. I just used an X-Acto blade and I just cut out a few angles on it to give me a sharp, pretty dull point. You don't get as much control when you sharpen it like this, but the benefit is that it lasts longer. This area is a pretty rough texture anyway, so I don't need that much detail. So this is going to work just fine. And I'll speed through the rest of this because it's the exact same thing that we did in last week's video when we worked on the left eye. Airbrush for the shadows, the eraser for highlights and textures, and of course a black colored pencil to sketch in these eyelashes. And finally, for these wrinkles underneath the right eye, I'm doing the same process of using that ribbed piece of paper to add the shadows of the wrinkles in first. And I just want to make sure that I'm going slow here. And again, always paying attention to my reference, trying to follow it to the best of my ability. And for the photo reference, I always print it out. You could even see on the bottom right-hand side of the screen that I just taped it to my canvas. And I'm using that to help guide me as I paint. So that's where we're going to wrap up the second part of this one. I will be back here next week and we will finish up the nose and the mouth. There's a lot of detail in that, so I want to make an entire separate video so we can cover it all. And for the forehead, the hair, and the hat that she's wearing along with the hand, I'll be including 2 extra videos on the members page so that I can go into more detail on those as well. And speaking of members, I want to say thank you so much to the generous and kind support of the channel members. First of all, I'd like to give a shout out and a welcome to the 2 newest members, both at tier 3, which is really generous of you guys, Mike and Hector. Thank you both so much and welcome. I also want to thank the oldest members on this channel who have been incredibly generous. That includes Dwayne, Robert, M. Shibley, Ken, Pete, and senior management, and Ralph. Thank you guys so much for your continued support. It really means the world to me, so thank you. And of course, thank you to the current channel members, which includes Peter C., Peter G., William, Rick, NH, Robin, Pascal, John, Adam, Jan, Christopher, Rick, M. Webb, Leon, Mackie Mark, Mere Creative, SM, Cyril, and Michael. You guys are really the best, and I can't thank you enough. Thank you all so much for watching. I'll be back here next week, and we will finish this one up. Take care. Have a great week.